They were never meant to survive, just scraps of paper written in frozen trenches, carried by men who would never return. Yet decades later, these forgotten letters began to speak again, revealing a truth no history book dared to tell. The Eastern Front wasn't only fought with bullets, but with words written by trembling hands, begging the world to remember. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in history began. Over 3.8 million Axis soldiers crossed an 1,800-mile front, supported by 3,400 tanks, 600,000 motor vehicles, and nearly 2,700 aircraft. Their objective was clear: destroy the Soviet Union's capacity to wage war within months. Facing them stood the Red Army with 2.7 million troops stationed along the western frontier. Though many were under-equipped, poorly positioned, or unprepared for the scale of the assault, it was the beginning of a war unlike any other, one not only of armies, but of ideologies and survival. Amid this vast machinery of destruction, letters became the only human thread connecting men on the front to a world beyond the battlefield. From the icy plains of Smolensk to the forests near Kiev, soldiers wrote home about weather, hunger, and fear, but also about faith, loyalty, and doubt. For many, correspondence was the last record of their existence. Both German and Soviet governments censored letters heavily, filtering emotion through propaganda, yet fragments of truth still survived. They revealed what official reports could not: the individual experience inside a conflict that consumed tens of millions. The ideological nature of the war was reflected even in its communication systems. German Field Post, Feldpost, became one of the most extensive networks ever established, delivering over 2 billion letters in 1942 alone. Each envelope carried more than ink. It carried morale. Censors deleted any mention of defeat, exhaustion, or disillusionment. The Soviet military maintained its own postal service, though less organized. Soldiers of the Red Army, often lacking envelopes or stamps, wrote on scraps of paper or the reverse side of military orders. Some messages were never sent. They were found later in dugouts or on frozen bodies. In the months before winter, the invasion advanced rapidly. Army Group North approached Leningrad, Army Group Center moved toward Moscow, and Army Group South encircled hundreds of thousands in Ukraine. In official communiques, victory seemed certain. Yet, in letters home, a different reality appeared. A German infantryman near Vyazma described roads lined with wrecks and endless columns of prisoners, but also confessed that the distances never end and the earth itself seems against us. On the Soviet side, a private from the 175th Rifle Division wrote to his wife, "They said the Germans would collapse after a few weeks. Now, we are the ones running, but we will return." The Eastern Front quickly became not only a battlefield, but a landscape of attrition, of men against weather, supply chains against distance, and conviction against despair. As autumn rains turned roads into mud, the Wehrmacht's mechanized strength faltered. Soviet resistance, initially chaotic, began to stiffen. Reinforcements from Siberia arrived, veterans of cold conditions and long marches. And as the temperature dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, letters took on new meanings. They were no longer mere updates, but confessions, private attempts to remain human amid dehumanization. In some sectors, postal systems broke down entirely. Censorship officers burned undelivered letters to prevent enemy intelligence from intercepting them. Entire battalions vanished, leaving behind stacks of unsent messages. A German report from Army Group Center estimated that in December 1941 alone, 18 million letters were delayed or lost due to weather and enemy action. For Soviet families, silence was even more common. Weeks, months, or years could pass without word from the front. Mothers queued outside local offices, clutching envelopes returned with the stamped word "Propal bez vesti," missing without a trace. The diaries and letters that survived, scattered across archives in Moscow, Berlin, and Warsaw, now form a parallel chronicle of the war. They provide insight not into strategy, but into endurance. The cold, the hunger, the endless repetition of violence. Soldiers who once believed they were part of a grand mission gradually wrote less about ideology and more about survival. In this frozen theater, propaganda lost its warmth. The only constant was the snow, falling equally on the victors and the doomed. As the front stretched deeper into Soviet territory, the meaning of home began to dissolve. A letter could take weeks to arrive, if at all, and for many, by the time their words reached loved ones, the writers themselves were already dead. These fragments of language, carried through frost and censorship, became the true diaries of the Eastern Front, a record not of conquests, but of endurance, doubt, and the slow freezing of hope. By November 1941, the German advance toward Moscow had reached its most ambitious point. Army Group Center, numbering nearly 1.9 million men, pushed through a landscape already consumed by frost. Supplies dwindled, and the myth of blitzkrieg met the reality of the Russian winter. Vehicles froze overnight, rifles jammed, and fuel congealed inside tanks. The temperature near Kalinin fell to minus 40 degrees Celsius. For the soldiers who had marched from the plains of Poland and Belarus, the war had become an elemental struggle against nature itself. Yet still, letters were written, to wives, to parents, to children, fragile bridges to a world that seemed impossibly far away. In these letters, one can trace the slow disintegration of optimism. A German officer wrote home, "The snow is endless, and the Russians never stop coming. It is not an army we fight, but the land itself." Censorship officials allowed such phrases to pass, perhaps because they seemed poetic rather than defeatist. On the Soviet side, political officers encouraged men to write of vengeance and endurance. One soldier near Tula penned, "The cold cuts like a knife, but so does the memory of our burned village. Every day we fight for those ashes. For every message sent, countless others were lost to frostbite, destruction, or the slow death of the couriers themselves." The Soviet Postal Service operated under extreme duress. Horses were used to transport sacks of letters through snow-covered terrain, guided by civilians recruited from nearby villages. Each sack weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms, and many couriers froze along the route. The letters that reached the home front were often smudged, blood-stained, or barely legible. For families, even a fragment was enough, a confirmation that someone still lived. Local newspapers printed anonymous excerpts as morale boosters, transforming private words into collective inspiration. Inside besieged Leningrad, where over 2.5 million civilians endured starvation and isolation, letters took on another meaning entirely. Communication with the outside world was nearly impossible. Instead, people wrote to themselves, keeping diaries that documented the slow collapse of daily life. School teachers recorded the shrinking rations, mothers listed the names of lost children, and factory workers described the silence of streets filled with snow and death. One young girl wrote in December 1941, "We are told to stay brave, but bravery has no taste, only hunger." On the German side, the early euphoria of conquest had turned into logistical nightmare. The army's supply lines, stretching hundreds of kilometers back to Poland, were paralyzed. Over 100,000 horses died between October and January, and fuel shortages forced entire divisions to abandon vehicles. Soldiers burned wooden houses for heat, leaving behind ghost villages. A letter from a corporal near Mojhaisk read, "We live in other people's homes, sleep in their clothes, and burn their walls to survive. We came as soldiers. We have become scavengers." Yet, in these same letters, one finds surprising humanity. Some men described moments of fragile beauty, the glitter of frost on barbed wire, the quiet of forests at dawn, the sound of distant singing from the enemy trenches. A German medic wrote to his mother, "Last night, the Russians sang something mournful before the attack. It sounded like prayer. For a moment, I thought of Christmas." The Soviet archives hold a reply from a nurse near Klin. "We hear their songs too. They sound lonely." December brought the counteroffensive. Reinforced by over 1 million fresh troops from Siberia and the Far East, the Red Army pushed the Wehrmacht back from the outskirts of Moscow. Letters from the Soviet side regained a note of triumph. The Germans flee before the frost. Even their steel is weak here. But among German soldiers, despair deepened. Entire regiments were encircled or destroyed, losing 120,000 men in just 6 weeks. "We are dying in the snow. one field post read. "No one will ever know our names." For the families who received such words, the war's true geography existed not on maps, but in envelopes. Each letter carried a piece of the front, the scent of smoke, the smudge of frozen ink, the tremor of a hand too numb to hold a pen. These were not just communications. They were testimonies of endurance written in real time, on the edge of human limits. Even as armies clashed for cities and ideology, it was these letters that revealed the deeper battle. One fought inside every soldier, between hope and surrender, between memory and oblivion. By early 1942, the Eastern Front had hardened into a static, merciless expanse of trenches, snow, and ruined towns. Both sides had survived the first winter, but at an appalling cost. German records estimated over 830,000 casualties by February, while Soviet losses had exceeded 4 million killed, wounded, or captured. The scale was beyond comprehension, yet life at the front continued, measured not in victories or defeats, but in the rhythm of daily endurance. Soldiers lived buried in dugouts, fed on frozen bread, and slept beside their rifles. Letters remained their only thread to the world beyond the frost, though even that connection was fragile, often severed for weeks by the chaos of war. The German Feldpost and Soviet military mail systems became lifelines of a psychological kind. A letter could mean survival, a reminder that one's suffering was seen, that existence still mattered. Soldiers on both sides carried correspondence inside their coats, close to their hearts. Some read the same note dozens of times until the paper dissolved from damp fingers. A Red Army soldier near Rzhev described how his entire platoon shared a single postcard from home. "We passed it around until the ink blurred. It wasn't what it said, but the smell of paper that reminded us we were alive." Yet censorship shaped these communications as much as cold and distance did. German letters underwent review by the Feldpost Prüfstelle, censorship stations that redacted anything hinting at defeatism, fraternization, or sympathy for the enemy. Soviet censorship was even stricter. Commissars inspected letters for ideological weakness, striking out sentences that questioned orders or mentioned hardship. Writers learned to speak in codes. "The weather is heavy" might mean the situation was dire. "The firewood is low" could refer to dwindling ammunition. The result was a strange shared language of omission, where silence often spoke louder than words. In the spring, as snow melted into impassable mud, both armies prepared for renewed offensives. The Germans planned operations toward Kharkov and the Caucasus, while Soviet forces aimed to retake ground near Leningrad and Sevastopol. Each new campaign brought new casualties, and with them, more letters of farewell. The Feldpost recorded over 25 million items in transit during April 1942 alone, the greatest volume of the war to the date. A German mother from Dresden received one that simply read, "If I don't return, know that I saw the Volga in my dreams." She never heard from her son again. In the Soviet Union, the government encouraged families to respond with patriotic enthusiasm. Women's committees organized letter drives, urging wives and mothers to write messages that would fortify the Red Warrior's spirit. Propaganda posters showed smiling postwomen delivering hope to the front. But in reality, millions of families had nothing to send. Villages burned, entire populations displaced, postal systems destroyed. A soldier might wait months for a reply that would never come. Some kept writing anyway, addressing letters to towns that no longer existed. The tone of correspondence evolved as the war dragged on. Early optimism faded into a weary fatalism. A German lieutenant wrote, "We no longer ask when we will go home, only whether we will survive the next thaw." His Soviet counterpart wrote, "I don't know what victory looks like anymore. Maybe it is simply to endure another night." These were not words meant for history, yet they became its truest record, unfiltered reflections of a conflict where ideology had been replaced by exhaustion. Civilians, too, lived through letters. Families in both countries pinned envelopes to walls or carried them in pockets as talismans. A widow in Smolensk preserved a burned scrap that read only, "Still alive, for now." To her, it was worth more than gold. Postal workers became quiet heroes of the war, navigating bombed railways and mined fields to deliver their fragile cargo. Some were killed en route, others disappeared into snowstorms, never to be found. Each lost mailbag meant the erasure of hundreds of human connections. Among historians, the letters from this period form a mosaic of disillusionment. They reveal how ordinary men and women began to see the futility of total war. The Germans, promised quick victory, realized they were trapped in an endless frozen nightmare. The Soviets, told they fought for liberation, confronted starvation, terror, and the endless toll of conscription. Yet neither side stopped writing. To write was to resist oblivion. To receive was to remember. By the summer of 1942, as the front moved south toward Stalingrad, the letters became shorter, more fragmented. Ink froze, pencils broke, and words gave way to numbers, coordinates, dates, casualty lists. But behind those numbers lay voices, individual, human, and haunting. Together, they formed an unspoken chronicle of the Eastern Front, not of strategy or glory, but of endurance in a landscape where even hope had to march in silence. The summer of 1942 brought with it a deceptive calm, a season of long days and brief moments of warmth that disguised the horror waiting ahead. Across the Eastern Front, soldiers briefly emerged from their dugouts, dried their boots, and wrote more letters than at any other time of the war. The Feldpost handled nearly 30 million pieces of mail each month, while Soviet couriers carried countless handwritten scraps, folded into ration wrappers or cigarette boxes. It was as if everyone sensed that the months ahead would erase many of these voices forever. In the south, the German army prepared for Operation Blue, a massive offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The objective was both strategic and symbolic, to seize Soviet oil fields and cut the Volga, the artery of the Red Army's supply network. Over 1 million Axis troops advanced, accompanied by 17,000 artillery pieces and 1,200 aircraft. Their movements were recorded not just in maps and communiques, but in the letters of those who marched. A German private from the 6th Army wrote home, "The steppe stretches to the horizon, and every sunset feels like eternity. They say the Volga will end the war. I wonder if we'll live to see it." Soviet soldiers and civilians sensed the storm coming. In Stalingrad, the local newspaper Stalingradskaya Pravda published letters from factory workers to the front. "We forge tanks while you fight for our homes." It was part morale campaign, part desperate plea. Many of these writers would later die in the bombardment that began in August. In return, frontline troops wrote letters full of gratitude and fatigue. One Red Army sergeant replied, "Tell the workers we are holding. Tell them to keep the lights burning in the factories so we can find our way back." As the German advance reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, the tone of correspondence shifted. The letters became fragmented, full of ellipses and unfinished thoughts. German soldiers, confident only weeks before, began describing confusion and the endless resistance of Soviet defenders. "They fight for every building, every floor, every stair," wrote one infantryman. "It's like drowning in bricks." Soviet letters were no less harrowing. "We live in the ruins," a female sniper wrote to her sister. "Our city breathes dust and blood, but it still breathes." Censorship intensified on both sides. German officers prohibited mention of casualties, frostbite, or retreat. Soviet commissars banned references to starvation or despair. Yet the truth leaked through in the smallest details. References to empty barracks, silent mornings, or new names on the list. Entire battalions disappeared into the rubble, leaving behind letters that never reached their destinations. Postal units in Stalingrad worked under shell fire, sorting envelopes in cellars lit by candles. Some clerks died at their desks, clutching unsent mail. By October, the 6th Army had entered the city, and correspondence nearly collapsed. Field post units operated within a few kilometers of the front line, and couriers used armored vehicles or horses to deliver letters under constant artillery fire. A German corporal described how his friend was killed while carrying mail bags. He fell beside the trench, and the letters flew out like birds into the smoke. On the Soviet side, communications were no better. The 62nd Army, trapped on the west bank of the Volga, relied on barges to ferry supplies and mail. Many never made it across. One recovered sack, fished from the river weeks later, contained 400 letters, each marked by water, mud, and unreadable ink. Yet even as the fighting turned into annihilation, the act of writing did not stop. It became, for many, a ritual against despair. Soldiers wrote by candlelight, on scraps of wallpaper, on the backs of maps. Some dictated letters to comrades with better handwriting. In November, as Soviet forces prepared their counteroffensive, a wounded lieutenant wrote to his wife, "If this is my last letter, know that I am not afraid. We have seen too much to fear anything now." His message was found in his coat after the battle. When the Soviet encirclement of Stalingrad began on November 19, 1942, cutting off 300,000 Axis troops, communication between the front and home collapsed completely. The Feldpost marked hundreds of thousands of soldiers as out of contact. Letters sent after mid-December were returned with the note Empfänger unbekannt, recipient unknown. Families waited months for word that would never come. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, letters from the front suddenly grew triumphant. "The city lives. The Germans are trapped," one writer declared. But between the lines lay exhaustion beyond celebration. In January 1943, as temperatures again plunged below -30, both sides faced the same enemy, hunger and silence. For the encircled Germans, last letters home were carried by wounded men attempting to escape the pocket or buried in frozen ground to be found decades later. One note read simply, "Cold, hungry, still thinking of you." On the Soviet side, victory was close but bitter. A nurse wrote to her mother, "We have won nothing yet. We are still burying them." By the time the last German radio signal was sent on February 2nd, 1943, the mailbags were gone, the couriers dead, and the city a cemetery of words. In the ruins of Stalingrad, letters became fossils, preserved fragments of thought, frozen in the rubble. For historians, they remain the truest voices of that battle, not generals or ideologues, but ordinary people trying to speak before the snow buried everything. After Stalingrad, the war on the Eastern Front entered a new phase, one of grim endurance and total mobilization. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, but the Wehrmacht remained formidable, retreating only to regroup and fight again. For the Red Army, victory had come at an impossible cost. Over 1 million casualties in that single campaign. Both sides faced the same reality. Millions of graves, frozen fields filled with wreckage, and a generation of men who no longer believed in quick endings. The letters that survived from 1943 reflect a profound change in tone. Gone was the illusion of glory. What remained was exhaustion, clarity, and the slow acceptance that this war would consume everything before it ended. In the spring, as the thaw returned, new offensives began. The German command prepared for Operation Citadel, a massive strike at the Kursk salient. It was to be Hitler's attempt to regain the initiative, a blow involving 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. Across the line, Soviet intelligence, aided by captured documents and partisan reports, anticipated the assault. Nearly 1.3 million Red Army soldiers fortified the defenses, laying over 400,000 mines and constructing 3,000 kilometers of trenches. In their letters, soldiers described the eerie calm before the storm. "The earth hums at night," one Soviet gunner wrote. "You can feel it, as if the ground itself is waiting for something terrible." German correspondence from this period shows the tension between duty and disbelief. "They tell us this will change the course of the war," wrote a panzer officer in June 1943. "But I no longer know what that means. The faces around me have aged 10 years. Field mail officers, already overburdened by the sheer number of dispatches, noted that morale had begun to fluctuate sharply. A report from the Feldpost Command in Army Group South stated that 15% of letters contained expressions of fatigue or longing for home, up from just 4% the previous winter. When the Battle of Kursk began on July 5th, it was the largest armored engagement in history. For 2 weeks, the front erupted in fire. Over 6,000 tanks clashed across open plains, and artillery barrages could be heard 200 kilometers away. Soldiers wrote during brief pauses, using ammunition boxes as tables. A German artilleryman recorded, "The sky glows all night. We can't tell where our line ends or begins. It is all one fire." On the Soviet side, letters became blunt and sparse. A platoon commander scrawled a note on the back of a map. "Still alive. 3 days without sleep. Send no letters. I can't read them anymore." Censorship continued, but even the censors were weary. Many had lost family members in Leningrad or Kharkov, and their edits became more lenient. Some letters passed through with open admissions of fear or grief. The Soviet Postal Department issued orders in August allowing families of fallen soldiers to receive their last letters unedited. These messages, the directive stated, represent the true face of sacrifice. For widows and mothers, that true face was often unbearable. Unfinished sentences, ink blurred by rain, pages torn by shell fire. As German forces withdrew from Kursk in mid-July, their correspondence reflected disbelief at the scale of destruction. "The steppe is filled with metal carcasses," one sergeant wrote. "We bury men beside tanks, and both already smell of rust." Losses on both sides were immense. Over 500,000 Soviet casualties and more than 180,000 German. Yet in Berlin and Moscow, newspapers still printed triumphant language. For the soldiers who lived through it, the only victory was survival. After Kursk, the tide turned decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. Red Army units advanced westward, retaking Orel, Kharkov, and Smolensk. Civilians in liberated villages sent letters to relatives they feared dead, though most never received a reply. Postal clerks sorted through heaps of undelivered envelopes, some dating back to 1941. Each bore a name that might no longer exist. "We sorted ghosts," one former postal worker later recalled. For German troops retreating through Ukraine and Belarus, the tone of letters became subdued, almost confessional. A soldier from the 2nd Panzer Division wrote in September 1943, "We no longer speak of victory, only of when this will end. The land swallows everything." His words echo countless others, fragments of disillusionment that slipped through the cracks of censorship. The Wehrmacht's propaganda office, aware of collapsing morale, distributed pre-written postcards bearing motivational slogans. Few used them. Most men preferred to write nothing at all. By the end of 1943, the Eastern Front stretched across 1,000 kilometers of devastation. Cities like Kursk and Belgorod were little more than rubble. Postal service infrastructure, constantly rebuilt and destroyed, struggled to function at all. The Soviet field post system processed over 1.5 billion letters that year, a testament not to communication, but to the persistence of faith. Even in ruin, people kept writing, as if words alone could rebuild what war had erased. Through these letters, a new kind of history was written, not by generals, but by the nameless millions who lived and died in the snow and mud. Their words no longer sought comfort or victory. They sought understanding. "If we survive," wrote one Red Army captain, "someone must remember what it was like to feel the world ending, and to keep writing anyway." By early 1944, the Eastern Front had become a continuous line of destruction, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Villages were ash, forests cratered, and rivers clogged with the remnants of machinery and men. Both armies were transformed beyond recognition. The Wehrmacht, once an instrument of rapid movement, had become an army of retreat, short on fuel, supplies, and hope. The Red Army, once desperate and defensive, now moved with grim confidence, its numbers swollen by over 6 million soldiers. Yet the human experience on both sides remained one of exhaustion. Letters from this period carry not the language of ideology, but of endurance, simple words written by people who no longer believed in grand causes. As Soviet forces advanced westward, their field post system followed close behind. Temporary post stations were established in tents, farmhouses, and railway wagons. Between January and May 1944, Soviet postal units delivered over 800 million letters, many carried by horseback or bicycle through newly liberated regions. Soldiers who had been fighting without contact for years finally wrote home again. "We are back on our own land," one infantryman wrote from near Vitebsk. "The air smells like spring. I can almost believe this will end." Yet many of these soldiers returned to villages erased from maps. Families were gone, entire districts deported or burned. Replies came rarely, and when they did, they often began with the same bleak words: "There is no one left here but me." In German correspondence, the tone darkened into fatalism. The letters of 1944 reveal a clear awareness of inevitable defeat. A lieutenant on the Dnieper wrote, "They call this a new line of defense, but it is only another place to die." Others wrote of endless marches, collapsing divisions, and the growing sense of betrayal by their leaders. Censorship, once strict, became inconsistent as morale plummeted. Some censors simply stopped blacking out forbidden sentences. The volume of mail dropped sharply as soldiers began to doubt that their words would reach anyone at all. The Wehrmacht's logistical collapse mirrored its moral one. Supply columns were destroyed by air raids, and postal trains were frequent targets. Reports from the Feldpost Direction Ost show that by mid-1944, up to 40% of all letters were either delayed indefinitely or lost. Soldiers improvised, entrusting their messages to civilians or captured mailbags. A German medic in Belarus wrote to his wife, "If this finds you, it means someone pitied me." His letter was discovered decades later among personal effects left behind in a burned-out farmhouse. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the letters of liberation were often intertwined with the letters of loss. Civilians emerging from years of occupation described scenes of devastation, churches turned into stables, cemeteries dug up for trenches, and children wandering without families. A schoolteacher from Poltava wrote to her brother at the front, "You may march home one day, but there will be no home to return to." Her words reflected a collective trauma that no victory could erase. Soldiers' replies were filled with attempts to comfort, or to remain silent. The Red Army's advance through Ukraine and Belarus revealed atrocities that changed the tone of the war entirely. Letters from this period, preserved in Soviet archives, speak of disbelief and horror. "We found a camp near Minsk," wrote one tank commander. "The people inside were not living, only waiting to die. I thought I had seen everything, but there is no name for this." Censors permitted such descriptions to pass, understanding their power to strengthen resolve. Yet they also exposed a terrible truth, that after years of violence, even the victors were numb. The correspondence between soldiers and families in 1944 became a mirror of a nation exhausted by its own endurance. In German letters, despair mixed with denial. "We are not fighting for the Führer anymore." One corporal wrote, "We fight because there is no way home." In Soviet ones, triumph was tempered by fatigue. "We push forward," wrote a rifleman from the First Baltic Front, "but every step feels heavier than the last." Among civilians, the act of writing took on new meaning. With towns destroyed and telephones useless, letters were the only remaining form of connection. People wrote on scraps of newspaper, birch bark, or ration wrappers. Some wrote not to the living, but to the dead. "To my son, Ivan," began one note found in a mass grave near Smolensk. "They say you died a hero. I only wish I could have buried you myself." These words, unsigned and undelivered, captured the unrecorded grief of millions. By the autumn of 1944, as Soviet troops entered Poland and the Baltic states, the front lines were shifting faster than communication could follow. Postal units often arrived days or weeks after the fighting had moved on. Letters were lost between worlds, written in one country, delivered in another. In many families, the final message from a loved one arrived months after news of their death. The delay gave grief a strange rhythm. Hope revived and extinguished over and over again. The year ended with both armies transformed into ghosts of their former selves. For the Germans, retreat had become survival. For the Soviets, victory had become endurance. And for the millions who waited at home, mothers, wives, children, letters had become a substitute for life itself. In them, the war was reduced to words scratched onto fading paper. "I'm still here. Don't forget me. Soon it will be over." But even as the end approached, no one knew what over would mean. Iwan, winter 1944 to 45 arrived as a kind of reckoning. The war was entering its final act, but the cruelty of its rhythm had not diminished. Across the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, from East Prussia to the Carpathians, entire populations were on the move. Soldiers retreating, refugees fleeing, prisoners liberated and then lost again. The correspondence that survived from these months no longer speaks of battles or victories. It speaks of collapse. Both armies wrote from a world that was falling apart, where geography itself seemed to lose meaning. For the Wehrmacht, now defending within Germany's pre-war borders, the letters of 1945 were the last entries in a long, disintegrating chronicle. Paper grew scarce, and ink froze in unheated shelters. Soldiers wrote with charcoal, on ration cards, or carved words into scraps of wood. One note from a private near Königsberg read, "It is no longer war, only waiting." His letter was never sent. Postal routes were destroyed, and many Feldpost stations ceased to exist as Soviet artillery advanced westward. Mailbags burned with the trains that carried them. Families in Dresden, Hamburg, or Vienna received nothing for months, only the silence that followed defeat. On the Soviet side, the correspondence of the final year carries a mixture of triumph and disillusionment. Red Army soldiers marched into territories that had once seemed mythical: Warsaw, Budapest, Königsberg, and finally Berlin. Their letters often began with pride, but ended in exhaustion. "We are inside Germany," wrote one sergeant in January 1945. "The houses are beautiful, the people afraid. I don't know if we have won anything yet." The front had become a moving city of mud, smoke, and fatigue. Every victory was paid for twice, once in blood and again in what it took from the spirit. In the newly liberated regions of Eastern Europe, civilians used letters as their first means of reclaiming identity. Survivors of ghettos and camps wrote to non-existent addresses, hoping someone remained to answer. A Polish woman freed from Majdanek wrote, "I send this to Warsaw, though I do not know if Warsaw exists." Soviet postal workers found themselves sorting mail for towns erased from maps, delivering to ruins where no one lived. The very act of writing became symbolic, an affirmation of life against the evidence of destruction. The tone of German letters shifted from disbelief to acceptance. Some were formal, almost detached, as if written for history. "If this is read one day," wrote an officer during the Vistula Oder offensive, "let it be known that we fought without hatred, only fear." Others were brutally honest. A nurse from Breslau confessed to her sister, "I no longer pray for victory, only for the shelling to stop so I can sleep." Censors were gone. There was no longer anything left to hide. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers described their advance through landscapes of unimaginable ruin. "Every village smells of smoke and death," one infantryman wrote from East Prussia. "We liberate places where no one is left to greet us." Some letters express a strange guilt, the realization that they were entering enemy territory, yet still human enough to pity what they found. A tank commander told his wife, "They look at us with the same eyes we had 3 years ago." Others, hardened by loss, wrote without empathy, "For every tear we shed, they will shed 10." Despite censorship and propaganda, even official communication began to reveal fatigue. Military newspapers like Krasnaya Zvezda printed letters praising the heroism of Soviet troops. Yet, between the lines, one could sense weariness. Reports from postal units recorded that soldiers were now writing fewer personal letters, often replacing them with short notes of 2 or 3 lines. "Alive," "advancing," "soon over" became the standard message. On the German side, those 3 words could have been written just as easily: alive, retreating, soon over. In both armies, correspondence also reflected the dissolution of structure. Commanders no longer reviewed outgoing letters, and mail often traveled in the pockets of soldiers moving in opposite directions. One German field post bag was captured by the Red Army near Poznan. Its contents included over 1,000 unsent letters, many written by men already dead. Soviet officers ordered them preserved as evidence of the moral collapse of fascism. Yet, when some of those letters were translated, they told a more complex story of fear, love, and resignation shared across enemy lines. By March 1945, the Red Army stood on the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. Soviet postal units could no longer keep up with the pace of the front. Letters home were written in haste, often unfinished. "Tomorrow we move," wrote one corporal. "If I fall, let them say I was not afraid." For many, that was the last trace of their existence. In April, during the Battle of Berlin, communication ceased entirely. The Feldposts stopped functioning, and the Soviet frontline post offices were overrun by their own advance. The war had outgrown its words. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, millions of letters remained undelivered, some buried, others burned, others carried home by soldiers who no longer knew whom to give them to. In the ruins of cities from Riga to Königsberg, children played among mailbags split open by shrapnel, scattering fragments of sentences across the rubble. "Don't worry," one read. "We will see each other soon." No one knew if it was a promise or a lie. Those final letters, preserved in archives and private collections, capture not victory or defeat, but something deeper. The last flickers of humanity written in a world consumed by war. Each line, fragile and trembling, reminds us that even in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, people kept writing, because to stop writing was to admit the silence had won. The war's end did not bring silence, only a new kind of noise. In the summer of 1945, across the vast territories once defined by the Eastern Front, millions of people searched for each other through the remnants of the postal system. Soldiers returning from the front, displaced civilians, former prisoners, and widows all began writing again. It was as if the entire continent tried to stitch itself back together with words. But the mail was no longer a symbol of hope. It had become an archive of loss. Every letter sent after the war had to pass through ruins, of cities, of families, of meaning itself. In Germany, the Feldpost was gone, replaced by improvised local offices established by Allied authorities. Piles of unsent wartime correspondence were found in basements and railway depots, some half-burned, others decades old. Volunteers began sorting them, trying to deliver what could still be read. A woman in Leipzig received a letter from her husband, written 3 years earlier in Stalingrad. It began, "When you read this, I will be home." For her, as for thousands of others, time itself had broken. The letter arrived, but the man never would. In the Soviet Union, a similar process unfolded on a massive scale. Postal authorities reopened routes from the Baltic to the Far East, handling over 2 billion pieces of mail between 1945 and 1946. But among those letters, many were addressed to the dead. Families who had waited in silence for years now received official notifications. Small folded cards stamped "Pogib Smrtyu Hrabrik," died a heroic death. These were followed, sometimes months later, by personal letters written before the soldier's final battle. "I'll return when the snow melts," one said. The card announcing his death arrived in spring. Civilians, too, wrote letters to the void. Mothers sent messages to sons buried in unmarked graves, wives to husbands missing since 1942, children to fathers they had never met. In some cases, the letters were delivered anyway, not to real addresses but to local memorial offices, where clerks would copy the messages into archives for remembrance. A widow from Rostov wrote, "You are gone, but I still write, because not writing would mean forgetting." The archives of post-war correspondence reveal a strange persistence of habit, as if people feared that the end of writing would erase the dead entirely. For many survivors, the letters that had survived the war became their most valuable possession. Soldiers carried them back from the front in metal tins or sewn into uniform linings. Civilians preserved them in cloth pouches alongside bread ration cards and identity papers. Some were buried under floorboards, others hidden in family Bibles. The paper was often yellowed, the handwriting fading, but to those who kept them, each word was sacred. "This is all that remains of him," one woman said in an interview decades later, showing a note written on the back of a map. "He touched this paper with his hands. That means he still exists, a little." At the same time, governments used letters to rebuild their own narratives of the war. In the Soviet Union, selected correspondence from soldiers and partisans was published in newspapers and textbooks as proof of patriotism and unity. Yet these letters were heavily edited, stripped of fear and doubt. The real messages, the ones about hunger, disillusionment, or terror, were locked away in archives. In Germany, Allied occupation authorities encouraged families to submit correspondence from the front to denazification offices. For many, this act was unbearable. "They are not propaganda," one widow protested. "They are all I have left of him." The meaning of letters had changed. During the war, they were lifelines. After it, they became memorials. In the years following 1945, tens of thousands of them were gathered into official collections across both East and West. The Soviet state created the Central Archive of War Letters, while in Germany, university historians began cataloging private correspondence from Stalingrad, Kursk, and Leningrad. What they discovered was not the language of ideology, but of shared suffering. In one archive, a German mother's last letter to her son sits beside a Soviet mother's letter to hers. Both end with the same sentence: "Come back to me if you can." For the men who survived, writing often stopped altogether. Veterans rarely spoke of the front. Their silence replaced the words they once sent home. A former Red Army captain, interviewed in 1963, admitted that he destroyed all his wartime letters. "I could not read them again," he said. "They were written by someone who no longer exists." In Germany, returning soldiers faced a different silence. Many found that their families were gone, their homes bombed, their cities divided. "There was no one left to write to," one recalled, "only the ruins." As the Cold War began, official histories of the Eastern Front buried the personal under the political. The letters that had survived were relegated to archives, forgotten except by scholars. Yet for those who had lived through it, the act of writing, or reading, remained a form of survival. In the Soviet Union, teachers sometimes read aloud wartime letters in schools. In post-war Germany, church memorials displayed excerpts from soldiers' final notes. The words, once meant for private eyes, became public prayers. By the end of the decade, the postal systems of both nations were fully restored. The war had ended, but its language remained: short, factual, resigned. "I'm fine. I work. I sleep." After so much loss, people no longer wrote about love or hope. They wrote about endurance. And in that endurance, the spirit of the Eastern Front lingered, not in the ruins, not in the monuments, but in the fragile handwriting that crossed continents and decades to remind the living what it meant to survive. By the early 1950s, the world had moved on, but the war's echoes persisted in quiet places: attics, drawers, and memory boxes where yellowed envelopes lay untouched. The soldiers who had written them were either buried across the steppes or trying to rebuild lives among the ruins. The Eastern Front had become history, a subject of textbooks and propaganda films. But for those who had lived it, it was still a wound that refused to close. The letters, once lifelines, now felt like relics from another existence. Some people could no longer bear to read them. Others read them nightly as prayers to the dead. In both the Soviet Union and the newly divided Germany, these letters became instruments of remembrance and control. In the East, the Soviet regime elevated the correspondence of fallen soldiers into a form of civic religion. Museums displayed letters under glass, framed by red banners. Newspapers printed letters from heroes every May to mark Victory Day. The chosen words always fit the state's narrative: courage, sacrifice, and unwavering belief in victory. Absent were the lines about hunger, doubt, or disillusionment that filled most real letters. Those were quietly removed from the public record, sealed in archives not meant to be opened. In West Germany, a different process unfolded. Families received packages containing the remains and effects of soldiers lost in the East: dog tags, diaries, or crumpled letters recovered from battlefields. Each envelope reawakened the war in a country trying to forget it. The government established tracing services to help relatives locate missing loved ones. Millions of inquiries flooded in. "My son was last heard from near Kharkov, January 1943. Is there any news?" Sometimes a single returned letter was all that remained. A widow in Munich kept one for the rest of her life, written just before Stalingrad. "I hear the wind every night. It sounds like home." Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, correspondence became a bridge between generations. Schools collected wartime letters to teach children about endurance and patriotism. Pupils wrote essays beginning with the phrase, "If I could answer the soldiers of the great patriotic war." The letters were recited at parades, broadcast on radio, and read in factories before shifts. Yet behind the ritualized reverence was something deeply personal. For millions of Soviet families, the only trace of a father, husband, or brother was a few lines written in pencil, often ending with, "Don't worry, I'll come back." The promise hung in every household, sometimes for decades. For those who had survived, the act of writing had changed forever. Veterans wrote briefly, mechanically. The war had drained words of their meaning. "We have said everything already," a former Soviet officer confessed in 1957. "Only silence feels honest now." German soldiers who returned from captivity faced the same emptiness. Their letters home, written after years in Soviet labor camps, often contained a single line. "I'm alive." Some added, "Please forget the rest." In rare cases, old letters resurfaced unexpectedly. During Reconstruction in the 1950s, workers clearing rubble in Warsaw, Minsk, and Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, found fragments of wartime mail buried under debris. One discovery, in a collapsed school basement in Smolensk, yielded dozens of letters written by students to Red Army soldiers in 1943. They were never delivered. "We believe in you," one child had written in careful handwriting. "Don't let our city die." The children were later killed in an air raid. The letters were sent posthumously to veterans as memorials. In East Germany and the Soviet bloc, these recovered messages became part of collective memory. They were used to reinforce unity between the liberators and the liberated. Yet, among ordinary people, the letters carried a more intimate meaning. In private, they were not symbols of ideology, but voices of the lost, men and women frozen in time. "I still talk to him through his letters," said one Russian widow interviewed in 1960. "I know he cannot hear me, but I can still hear him." Scholars who began to study wartime correspondence noticed a shared language of endurance across enemy lines. The phrasing of farewell, the descriptions of cold, hunger, and longing, they were nearly identical whether written in Russian, German, or Polish. A historian in Leningrad wrote, "The letters show that the front was not only a line of battle, but a mirror. Both sides stared into the same abyss." This realization unsettled authorities who had built entire ideologies on division. The archives of letters were quietly restricted, accessible only to state-approved researchers. By the 1960s, a generation had grown up surrounded by the myth of victory, but disconnected from the personal pain behind it. Veterans who kept their letters did so in secrecy. Some burned them before death, fearing misunderstanding or misuse. Others entrusted them to their children, who rarely knew what to do with them. "They are not stories," said one man whose father died at Kursk. "They are voices. You don't read them, you listen." Across Europe, time continued to erase the physical traces of the war, but the words endured. Museums, archives, and families preserved the fragile pages, folded, stained, sometimes written in blood. In 1967, during preparations for the 25th anniversary of Stalingrad, Soviet officials unearthed a letter from a young soldier found in the ruins of a bunker. "I don't know if anyone will find this. If you do, remember that we were here and we believed." The line was printed on posters and monuments, translated into dozens of languages. For a generation weary of propaganda, it felt genuine. It was one sentence of truth among decades of silence. The war had ended, but its words continued to travel across time, language, and memory. Each rediscovered letter was a reminder that history is not written only in battles or treaties, but in the private moments of those who endured them. The Eastern Front had devoured nations, but through the letters it had left behind its human echo, fragile, unfinished, and eternal. Time eventually transformed the letters from the Eastern Front into something beyond history, into memory itself. By the late 20th century, as veterans aged and archives opened, the private writings of soldiers and civilians began to resurface in museums, documentaries, and exhibitions. What had once been personal became collective, and what had once been silence began to speak again. Yet the voice that emerged was not one of glory or victory, but of endurance. The letters revealed what official histories could not, how individuals survived in a world where survival itself had lost meaning. In both Russia and Germany, historians started publishing selections of wartime correspondence. The tone of these publications differed, but the emotional truth was the same. Soviet anthologies emphasized heroism, yet even between lines of state-approved optimism, one could feel exhaustion and longing. German collections, freed from censorship, spoke more openly about despair and guilt. "We marched east as soldiers," one former Wehrmacht officer wrote in his foreword to a 1978 edition of Front Letters, "but we returned as witnesses." For many readers, these words became the first real encounter with the human reality behind the myth of the Eastern Front. The letters also began to bridge generations. Children and grandchildren of soldiers discovered boxes of correspondence hidden in cupboards and attics, often unopened for 50 years. Some found only fragments, half-burned pages, or torn envelopes. Yet even incomplete sentences carried a weight no monument could equal. "We were alive once," read one recovered note found in a demolished Berlin apartment. It was not addressed to anyone. It seemed to be written to time itself. Such discoveries reignited a quiet dialogue between the living and the dead, a dialogue that continues still. Academics who studied the letters noticed recurring patterns that transcended nationality: fear of cold, longing for home, fatigue, disbelief at survival. But beneath those surface similarities lay profound differences in worldview. Soviet soldiers often wrote from a collective perspective, about duty, comrades, and the motherland, while German soldiers wrote in solitude, focused on family and individual fate. Both, however, expressed the same quiet astonishment that they were still alive amid chaos. "The snow keeps falling," one Red Army infantryman wrote in 1944, "and I am still here. Perhaps that is already victory." In the post-war decades, both countries turned these private words into public symbols. The Soviet Union built museums dedicated to the Great Patriotic War, displaying letters in glass cases like sacred relics. In East Germany, the letters of anti-fascist fighters were taught in schools. In West Germany, small exhibitions focused on human suffering rather than ideology. Yet, even as they became instruments of remembrance, their intimacy remained intact. Every viewer who stood before them felt the same quiet realization that behind every date, every map, and every statistic stood a single trembling hand holding a pencil in the cold. By the 1980s and 1990s, as the last veterans passed away, interest in these documents surged once again. Filmmakers and historians began reconstructing entire battles from letters alone, piecing together events through the words of ordinary men. In Russia, a project titled Pisma s Fronta, Letters from the Front, digitized over 2 million handwritten messages, some scanned from crumbling paper, others read aloud by actors on radio. In Germany, the Deutsches Historisches Museum launched a similar archive, collecting both Wehrmacht and civilian correspondence. Together, these efforts revealed an undeniable truth. The Eastern Front was not only fought on fields and in cities, it was also fought on paper. As the century ended, new generations began reading the letters not as relics of nationalism or trauma, but as lessons in humanity. Students in Moscow, Berlin, Warsaw, and Kiev studied them side by side, comparing voices that had once belonged to enemies. The similarities were haunting. Both sides spoke of hunger, snow, and dreams of home. Both wrote about the faces of children they would never see again. Both described the same endless winter, a frozen hell that swallowed millions, yet left words behind like footprints on the ice. Today, those words continue to travel. Museums display them online, historians quote them, and descendants read them at commemorations. Some have been translated into dozens of languages, carried across continents far from the battlefields where they were written. And yet, even in translation, they retain the same quiet dignity, the refusal to disappear. Every letter, whether written by a Soviet conscript outside Stalingrad or a German medic retreating through the Baltic, says the same thing in the end: remember that I was here. In the end, perhaps that is what the Eastern Front diaries truly represent: Not documents of war, but proof of existence. They remind us that even in the most inhuman conditions imaginable, people reached for connection, for words, for meaning. The frozen hell did not destroy language. It purified it. It reduced everything, ideology, politics, even hope, to the simplest human truth, the desire to be heard. When we read these letters today, we are not reading history alone. We are listening to voices that once trembled in the cold, carried across decades of silence to reach us. They belong to no nation now. They belong to memory itself. And as long as their words are read, as long as someone, somewhere, opens a page and whispers those last lines, the war that sought to erase them will never entirely succeed.